Tonight, we drift to the sleepy waterfronts of Long Island, 1974, a place of sailboats and manicured lawns, where the American dream was supposed to be alive and unbroken. On Ocean Avenue stood a Dutch colonial house with bright white siding and iconic quarter-moon windows that seemed to smile at the street. Neighbors called it charming, a picture of family stability. But in the cold hours before dawn, that illusion shattered. Inside, 6 members of the DeFeo family lay dead in their beds, shot one by one, as if swallowed by silence itself. No cries for help, no frantic footsteps. Just the echo of gunfire that no one claimed to hear. From that night forward, the house ceased being a home. It became something else, a shrine to violence, a canvas for myths, a mirror for our deepest fears. To some, it was the scene of a brutal crime. To others, it was the cradle of a haunting that would captivate the world. And half a century later, we're still asking, what really happened inside 112 Ocean Avenue? The photograph is grainy, black and white, its details half swallowed by shadow. 6 figures lie stiff beneath thin sheets, their forms unnervingly aligned as if they had rehearsed for death. Each face frozen, not in terror, not in fight, but in something stranger, compliance, not a sign of struggle. Not a single overturned chair, just silence where there should have been chaos. And then the words whispered years later by one of the only survivors of that house. Words that crawl like insects under the skin. I heard them walking, but nobody was alive to walk. Amityville, a name that carries the stink of pulp novels and Hollywood franchise excess. But strip away the overblown mythology, the seance theatrics, and what you're left with is still obscene. 6 family members wiped out in one night, a son who confessed, a town that never healed, and a question that refuses to die. Was this tragedy the work of a single hand, or did something darker grip the house and make murder inevitable? The crime scene investigators recorded something curious. The rifle blasts were deafening, yet neighbors reported no screams, no scuffling. Not even a panic cry. How does a family die in order, one by one, while the others wait in silence for their turn? Unless they didn't wait. Unless the truth is uglier than the story sold to us. When the police finally pulled the sheets back, the victims looked almost staged, placed as if to mock human understanding. Each corpse facing downward, hands neatly gathered, a grotesque symmetry, like dolls positioned for a child's sinister game. And then the young man, the son of the family, sat in custody with a voice flat as concrete. Once I started, I couldn't stop. He claimed it, owned it, then blamed others, then recanted, then shifted again. His words twisted like smoke, impossible to hold. So we begin here, with a house in the quiet suburbs of Long Island, where the walls still whisper in the ears of anyone who dares spend a night. Was it madness, possession, conspiracy? Or just a simple, unadorned horror of a family devoured from within? Nothing about Amityville should make sense. But the most disturbing truth is this. Beneath the carnival of ghost stories and movie deals lies a crime scene that has never quite settled into history, like a body refusing to decompose. This isn't about jump scares or creaking floors. This is about 6 people who should be alive today, except they're not, because someone or something wanted it that way. The year is 1974, and America is already suffocating under the weight of its own nightmares. The Vietnam War bleeds out across television screens. Watergate erodes trust like acid. And the suburbs, those white fence utopias promised to the middle class, are quietly fermenting with discontent, addiction, and unspoken violence. Long Island, New York, was supposed to be the antidote to urban decay. Post-war developers carved it into grids of cul-de-sacs, where every lawn was clipped into perfection and every house looked like the next. Yet beneath that neatness was the same rot festering everywhere else. A house was just a box. A family was just a fragile arrangement of roles. And when those arrangements snapped, when the box failed to contain what lived inside, everything spilled out. Amityville was not a city of crime legends. It was sleepy, even dull. Waterfront views, small-town diners, the sound of boat engines rolling across the South Shore. Residents whispered about property taxes, not hauntings. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was, to all appearances, enviable. A Dutch colonial with gabled windows like watching eyes, perched elegantly by the canal. Inside lived the DeFeo family. Parents Ronald and Louise, their 2 daughters and 3 sons. To the neighbors, they were just another Catholic family, chasing the American script of discipline, religion, and appearances. But appearances lie. The patriarch, Ronald DeFeo Jr., was known for his temper, explosive, domineering, quick to turn a household into a theater of fear. He barked at his children, barked at his wife, barked at anyone who dared challenge him. His eldest son, Ronald Jr., Butch, absorbed that fury like a sponge. Outside, he wore bell-bottoms and a slick-back hairstyle, a poster child of the 70s rebellion. Inside, he drowned himself in drugs, heroin, and resentment, chafing against a father who saw weakness as sin. The DeFeos had money, at least for a while. Ronald Sr. had worked his way into the Buick dealership business, providing the family with that perfect house and that perfect lifestyle. But money doesn't buy peace. It buys walls high enough to hide misery. The home became a pressure cooker, a father's tyranny, a son's rebellion, a mother's futile prayers, children navigating the fault lines. And so Amityville in 1974 was not merely a town, not merely a year. It was the perfect stage for collapse, a backdrop of suburban conformity hiding a storm of dysfunction, a culture that preached silence over confrontation, loyalty over honesty. When families cracked, they cracked privately behind curtains until the fracture burst through the wallpaper. The murders of November 13th, 1974, didn't happen in isolation. They were born of this stage, of a society pretending it was healed, of a family pretending it was whole, of a house pretending it was safe. And when all those pretenses snapped at once, what emerged was not just violence, but something stranger, something uncanny, something that has kept us staring at that house for nearly half a century, wondering what truly lived inside it. Let's talk about Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr., the reluctant protagonist of this cursed narrative. Imagine a young man who looks like he stepped off the set of Saturday Night Fever, long hair, flared pants, leather jackets. But beneath the swagger, he's a mess stitched together by narcotics, paranoia, and years of humiliation. He was the eldest son, the one who should have inherited his father's respect. Instead, he became the punching bag, the disappointment, the addict nobody could save. Butch's life was a cocktail of contradictions. He drove a flashy car bought by his father, yet seethed with hatred toward the man who funded it. He played the part of the tough guy, carried himself with the arrogance of someone untouchable, yet at night he whispered to friends that his house wasn't normal, that strange things stirred in its shadows. Was that paranoia talking, or something deeper? Hard to tell, because the drugs blurred every line. By his early 20s, Butch was already spiraling. He worked at his grandfather's car dealership, but showed up high, skipped shifts, stole cash. He carried rifles, handguns, always flaunting them like props in a performance of masculinity he didn't believe in. His friends described him as volatile, unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes pitifully desperate for approval. The perfect storm of insecurity and rage. But here's the tragic irony. In another time, in another family, Butch might have just been the neighborhood burnout, the guy who smokes too much weed, borrows money, talks big about plans he'll never make good on. But inside that house on Ocean Avenue, with a father who ridiculed him in a family hierarchy that suffocated him, he became something else entirely. He became combustible. The real cruelty of this case is that every player feels trapped. The father locked in his iron fist need for control. The mother resigned to a life of submission and rosaries. The children, young and voiceless, orbiting around the conflict like satellites destined to crash. And then Butch, the eldest, absorbing it all, letting resentment metastasize until it no longer had anywhere to go but out. When the murders happened, Butch's confession felt almost inevitable. He admitted it, then denied it, then spun out stories about shadowy figures, mob ties, demonic whispers. The truth is, his identity had already fractured long before the rifle shots rang out. By the time his family was gone, it was hard to tell whether he was a remorseless killer, a manipulated pawn, or a young man finally giving form to years of unspeakable rage. To know Butch DeFeo is to know the fulcrum of the Amityville mystery. Was this all his doing, an eruption of madness in a single night, or was he just the most visible casualty of a house that seemed determined to consume everyone who entered it? It begins in the dead of night, November 13th, 1974. The kind of night when the canals of Amityville lie still as mirrors, when even the neighborhood dogs go quiet. And inside 112, Ocean Avenue, the walls are holding their breath. At some point after 3 a.m., Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. picks up his father's .35 caliber Marlin rifle. That detail alone should send a chill up the spine. Not a handgun, not something discreet. This was a deer rifle, loud enough to rupture the stillness of an entire block. The first shots ring out in the master bedroom. His parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise, are killed as they sleep, or at least as they lie motionless. No screaming neighbors, no sound of struggle, no attempt to flee. Just two lives extinguished in an instant, and then Butch moves room to room. Two brothers, two sisters, each one shot as they lay in their beds. 6 victims in under half an hour. Each body found face down, as if arranged, as a complicit in their own silence. Here's where the disturbance becomes unbearable. How do 6 people die in sequence without the others waking, running, clawing, fighting? Even the coroner admitted it made no sense. Some whispered they'd been drugged, though toxicology found nothing. Others said maybe they were paralyzed by fear. But what fear can mute a house that large when rifles are exploding in the night? And then the aftermath, the eerie calm. Butch showers, changes clothes, discards a rifle and bloody garments, and heads to work as though the night hadn't happened. He jokes with coworkers. He calls his girlfriend. He acts like an average young man passing through an average day, while 6 bodies lie cooling in their beds just a few blocks away. It's almost cinematic, this bizarre split between the crime and the performance that followed. And yet, when evening falls, cracks appear. Butch walks into a bar rattled and blurts, "You gotta help me. I think my family's been shot." He leads friends and police back to the house, back to that staged mausoleum. The disturbance is not only in the act itself, but in the reaction of everyone who entered the house that night. Officers, hardened men used to corpses, admitted the scene unnerved them in ways they couldn't explain. 6 family members, all face down, sheets tucked. No mess of panic, no desperate flight toward the door. Just a quiet orderliness to a massacre that should have been chaos. Something happened in that house beyond the bullets. A disturbance more profound than noise or blood. An atmosphere shift, a rupture in logic itself. This is the moment when Amityville ceased being just another crime scene and began mutating into legend. Here's where the story starts to unravel into madness, because the facts won't stay still. On paper, the case looks straightforward. The eldest son killed his family, but nothing about it sits right. Nothing. Start with the neighbors. They should have heard the rifle. Again, this wasn't a silenced weapon. It should have ripped through the neighborhood like thunder. And yet, silence. One neighbor admitted he heard the family's dog barking wildly, but no gunshots. None. as though the sound had been swallowed whole by the house itself. Then there's the posture of the bodies. 6 people, all face down, hands tucked. Did they turn willingly, like children lining up for some twisted bedtime ritual? Or were they placed that way after death? Forensic investigators could never explain it cleanly. If Butch dragged them, there should have been marks, evidence of movement. There wasn't. And what about the timeline? Butch originally told police it must have been a mob hit. After all, the DeFeos weren't strangers to shady connections. His grandfather had dealings in Brooklyn, and whispers of mafia involvement weren't exactly unusual in 70s New York. But if it were a hit, why leave a living witness? Why let Butch survive? Then came his own confessions, plural, because he couldn't keep them straight. First, he admitted to killing them. Then he claimed his sister Dawn helped, that she killed some of the siblings before he turned the rifle on her. Later, he insisted shadowy figures were in the house, that voices commanded him, that it wasn't him at all. His story shifted like quicksand, and investigators couldn't tell if they were dealing with a pathological liar, a paranoid addict, or someone who had truly stepped off the map of sanity. The autopsies raised even more questions. No drugs found in the victim systems. So sedation was out. No defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. It was as if the family allowed themselves to be executed, one by one, in a kind of trance. That detail alone has fueled decades of speculation. And then came the whispers, the townsfolk, the press, the curious, that the house itself was cursed, built on Native American burial grounds. Some claimed a magnet for evil, a place where reality bends. Of course, skeptics scoffed, pointing out that folklore always emerges when logic fails. But still, people couldn't stop looking at those windows, those eye-like gables, convinced they'd blink if you stared long enough. The deeper you dig, the more the mystery resists resolution. A single truth refuses to emerge. Was this a son's act of rage? A conspiracy among siblings gone wrong? Or did the house itself demand a sacrifice and the DeFeos, tragically, eerily, obliged? What we're left with isn't clarity, but dissonance. A case that should be cut and dry instead feels like a hall of mirrors, every angle reflecting something impossible. The investigation into the Amityville killings was like watching detectives wrestle shadows. Every time they thought they had a grip, the outline slipped. The official stance was clear. Butch DeFeo had slaughtered his family in cold blood. He confessed, after all. But even the authorities couldn't entirely ignore the cracks in that narrative. For one, there was the silence of the night. Multiple detectives admitted off-record that it bothered them, that it didn't add up. A high-powered rifle fired 8 times indoors should have woken half the block, should have sent people running into the streets. Yet no one came. The house itself seemed to eat sound, like an accomplice cleaning up after the crime. Then came the alternative theories. Mob involvement, probably the most grounded. The DeFeo family had relatives linked to organized crime, and Butch's erratic behavior, his theft of dealership money, might have put them in the crosshairs. A mob hit disguised as a family annihilation? Plausible, except the bodies were arranged too neatly, too ritualistically, for typical mob work. Professional killers don't tuck you in afterward. The sibling theory. Butch claimed that his sister Dawn played a role, that she killed some of their siblings before he turned on her in rage. Defense attorneys toyed with the idea, painting Butch as less a monster and more a participant in a tragic chain reaction. But physical evidence didn't fully support it. Dawn had gunshot residue, yes, but whether that proved her hand on the trigger or just proximity remained contested. And then, the supernatural angle. Detectives rolled their eyes, but the theory wouldn't die. Butch himself fanned the flames, saying he heard voices, that a presence in the house urged him on. Paranormal investigators latched onto it, pointing to the house's supposed cursed land, claiming the strange silence, the absence of resistance, The impossible neatness of the bodies could only mean something beyond human hands was at work. Forensic science had no answer for how 6 people allowed themselves to be executed without a fight. Folklore was eager to supply one. The prosecution, of course, stuck with the simple explanation. A troubled, drug-addicted young man snapped and slaughtered his family. Case closed. The defense countered with insanity, voices, hallucinations, a mind too fractured to know reality from delusion. Experts debated his state of mind, but in the end, the jury didn't buy it. They wanted someone to blame, and Butch was right there, flesh and blood, sitting in the courtroom. But the theories never went away. Mob hit, sibling conspiracy, supernatural curse, or simply a young man succumbing to rage and heroin paranoia. None of them fully closed the case. Each solved one piece and left another dangling. The truth about Amityville has always been like that, partial, fragmented, as if the house itself refuses to let anyone fit all the pieces together. And maybe that's the real horror, that even in the hands of detectives, prosecutors, and psychiatrists, the story never snapped shut. It only kept breathing long after the trial was over. The trial was supposed to provide clarity, but instead it turned into theater, ugly, chaotic, mesmerizing theater. In the courtroom, Butch DeFeo looked less like a cold-blooded killer and more like a broken marionette, jerking between contradictions. One day, he swore he killed them all alone. The next, he insisted his sister Dawn fired the shots. Then, as if possessed by his own script, he ranted that shadowy figures had guided his hands, that voices told him who had to die and when. The jury watched a man unravel. Was it performance, manipulation, or the visible collapse of a psyche that had been collapsing for years? Nobody could tell. Even seasoned court reporters admitted they couldn't read him. He didn't project remorse. He didn't project pride. He projected confusion, as if he himself no longer knew which story was true. The turning point came when the defense leaned hard into the insanity plea. They painted Butch as a man gripped by psychosis, tormented by hallucinations, incapable of distinguishing reality from nightmare. Expert witnesses spoke of dissociation, delusions, the corrosive effects of heroin and LSD. They conjured an image of a man who was not evil but broken. But the prosecution fired back with something colder. Order. 6 bodies, all arranged face down. No chaos. No frantic spray of bullets. No evidence of blind rage. The killings had structure. They said, deliberation, a methodical progression from room to room, victim to victim. That wasn't madness. It was intent. And then came the photographs. Black and white crime scene images projected for the jury. The father's massive frame under sheets. The small children lifeless in their beds. Each sibling lined up in symmetrical surrender. The images spoke louder than any lawyer. This was no random frenzy. It was an execution. In that moment, the public began to divide sharply. Some saw a monster, cold and calculating, deserving of every ounce of punishment. Others saw a young man imploding under the weight of abuse, drugs, and perhaps, though no court would admit it, forces beyond comprehension. Butch was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The jury dismissed insanity. They wanted resolution, even if it was an imperfect one. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. The courtroom closed, the gavel fell, but the breakdown didn't end there, because almost immediately after conviction, rumors began mutating again. Friends swore he wasn't capable. Paranormal investigators descended on Ocean Avenue, claiming the murders were only the beginning. And inside prison walls, Butch himself kept rewriting the story. First one version, then another, each more bizarre, each more contradictory. The turning point, then, wasn't a conviction. It was a realization that the truth of Amityville was never going to stay still, that even locked behind bars, the case had slipped free of logic, free of narrative, and was now something else entirely, a riddle that would feed on speculation forever. On paper, the resolution is neat. Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. spent the rest of his life behind bars. The state's satisfied. The book's closed. But that's the illusion. The file folder marks solved that doesn't really solve anything. Because the lingering questions linger, like rot you can't scrub out. Take the silence of that night. 6 gunshots, then 2 more inside a wooden house. Yet no one screamed, no one fled, no one called for help. How? Experts still can't reconcile it. Some insist the victims were drugged despite toxicology tests saying otherwise. Others claim sheer shock immobilized them. But shock doesn't keep you still while your siblings are being executed one by one. It's a riddle without a rational answer. And then there's the sister, Dawn. Her involvement is still a specter over the case. Did she conspire? Did she fire a weapon? Was she murdered in the chaos of a sibling pact gone wrong? Butch swore she had a role, then swore she didn't, then swore shadow people used her as a puppet. Forensics gave no clear verdict. Gunpowder residue on her nightgown suggested possibility, not certainty. The truth drowned in ambiguity. Even the arrangement of the bodies haunts. Face down, tucked neatly, as though someone staged them, or as though they surrendered willingly. Investigators still disagree. A few quietly admitted the scene looked unnatural, almost ritualistic, almost performed. The official story, that a single drug-addled maniac methodically killed his family, explains the what but not the how, not the eerie compliance, not the missing noise, not the way the house seemed complicit, silent, swallowing every sound of violence. And so we're left with a resolution. That is no resolution at all. Butch DeFeo is guilty, yes, but is he guilty alone? Is he guilty in the way the state claimed? Or was he only the human face of something larger? Whether that something was family dysfunction boiling over, mafia-ties, silence, and blood, or the darker possibility that the house itself demanded it? The lingering questions turned the Amityville murders from a tragedy into a myth. They are the cracks that never healed, the reason this case never faded into the anonymous archives of suburban crimes. Something doesn't fit. Something never will. And maybe that's why, half a century later, the story of Ocean Avenue still stares back at us like those gabled windows, unblinking, unanswerable. The house didn't stay empty long. Death rarely deters real estate, especially when the property has waterfront views and a Dutch colonial frame that looks like it belongs on a postcard. Within 13 months, new owners moved in, George and Kathy Lutz, with their 3 children. They lasted 28 days. 28, not because of mold or creaky plumbing, but because they swore something malignant lived in those walls. Their claims detonated like dynamite in the public imagination, black ooze seeping from keyholes, swarms of flies appearing in the dead of winter, voices whispering from nowhere, George waking at 3:15 a.m., the supposed hour of the DeFeo murders, every single night. And then there was the most chilling detail, their daughter talking to an imaginary friend named Jody, who wasn't imaginary at all, according to her descriptions. The Lutzes fled, leaving their possessions behind, and their story quickly metastasized into pop culture. Books, films, documentaries, sequels. The Amityville Horror became less a tragedy and more a brand. The legacy was hijacked, spun into carnival rides of demons and green ectoplasm. The public devoured it, of course. Fear sells. But lost in that frenzy were the real 6 bodies. The DeFeo children who never grew up. The parents whose graves became footnotes in ghost tours. The commercialization of Amityville turned a crime scene into an industry, and with it came a strange ethical rot. Are we telling a story about murder, or are we selling tickets to a haunted house attraction? The line blurred beyond recognition. Yet the legacy of Amityville cuts deeper than Hollywood. It became a cultural mirror, a reminder that the American dream home, the idyllic suburban box with its white fences, could also be a coffin. That dysfunction, silence, and rage could fester behind lace curtains until one night, the facade collapsed in rifle fire. It was a case study in how quickly safety becomes illusion. And even as skeptics tore the Lutz's account apart, even as journalists called their haunting a hoax, the seed was planted. Amityville meant evil. The house became shorthand for corruption, for unspeakable family secrets, for the uncanny way blood doesn't wash out no matter how many new coats of paint you slap on the walls. Today, the property still stands. New owners have lived there, swearing it's just a house, just wood and nails. They insist nothing stirs at night, nothing whispers. And maybe that's true, but the legacy doesn't depend on what happens inside anymore. It lives outside in our collective imagination, in every headline that trots out the word Amityville like a curse. The story is immortal now, whether we like it or not. Every crime has a grave, but some graves keep digging back. Amityville is one of them. A story that refuses to settle into history, that claws at us because the answers never lined up neatly. Maybe it was just a broken young man, high on rage and chemicals, finally snapping beneath the boot of an abusive father. Or maybe it was a conspiracy, a sibling pack gone feral. Or maybe, God help us, it was the house itself, a structure that seemed to inhale sound, exhale madness, and cradle its victims into submission. What unsettles me most isn't the killings themselves. Humanity is capable of worse. Every day. It's the silence, that void where screams should have been. 6 people executed in sequence, and the house stayed quiet, like a stagehand sweeping up after play. That silence is the real haunting, the thing logic can't scrub away. Think of it. A family trying to play at normality in a neighborhood built on the promise of safety. A facade of Catholic devotion, financial stability, American respectability. And behind it, fists, needles, paranoia, whispered voices. The gun was just a punctuation. The real horror was the sentence that came before it. A slow erosion of trust until family became enemy. And yet, the myth swallowed the truth. The DeFeo's ghost became entertainment. Their tragedy, packaged in paperback and celluloid, sold as popcorn scares. That might be the darkest twist of all, that our need for spectacle devoured their humanity, turning a blood-stained home into a carnival attraction. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the myth is the truer version. If the legend we spun was simply our way of translating the inexplicable. Maybe we needed demons and curses because the alternative, that a young man methodically executed his family while they lay still and silent, is too unbearable to hold. Maybe the myth isn't a distortion but a coping mechanism. In the end, Amityville remains a mirror. Look into it, and you'll see whatever terrifies you most. Dysfunctional family, addiction, violence, possession, take your pick. The house doesn't care which version you believe. It just keeps standing there, windows staring, waiting for the next fool to look too long and realize the gaze is being returned. And that is the truth of Amityville. It is not a story about ghosts. It is a story about silence. And silence, as we've seen, can kill. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.